Hello, this is Larry. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer for the Collapse Survival app.
And I'm Drew Miller. I'm a retired Air Force Colonel, CEO of Fortitude Ranch, the nation's largest recreational and survival community, and one of many survival experts that supports Collapse Survivor.
Last week, our second collapse simulation ran on the Collapse Survivor app. This one was a domestic civil war that grew out of a violent Biden-Trump election battle. The purpose of this podcast is to review the collapse threat and the key lessons learned on the preparedness from this scenario and simulation. We define a collapse as the economy stops working and there is widespread, long-lasting loss of law and order, and as a result, usually high casualties, sometimes fatalities up into the millions.
Last week we had a really bad, severe collapse, but the level of violence and collapse in this scenario was relatively mild.
There are a lot of indications that election violence and possibly civil war is coming this year, so we're going to take a look at this threat and some measures to prepare. Now, before we get going, we want to show you how, if you don't like getting lots of new exercise message notifications on your phone, you can turn those off with the app notifications. So on the app setup page, touch the three bars in the upper left, then select settings. This screen on the right will come up. Slide the notification button off for simulation if you don't want to push notifications coming through to your phone. You will then have to remember that Monday morning through Saturday night, messages come through roughly from 07 a.m. in the morning until 8 p.m. U.S. local time, depending on where you're at.
Some people do like to have the simulation play live, get the notifications, and every time there's something, look at it and maybe talk about it with their friends. But if you're busy at work, don't want the notifications bothering you, as Larry said, just turn them off. And then you can run through at the end of the day or even the end of the week and catch up.
And once a live simulation is done, it goes into the archive section of the simulation. So you can play it at your own pace, go through all 6 days, 100 or so message items at once, and as fast as you would like.
So you may remember there was an exercise message you got saying that Ray Dalio, one of the smartest men alive, the CEO of the largest hedge fund, Bridgewater, who makes his living by trying to predict the future accurately, and he does it pretty well. He estimated a 30% chance of civil war in the past.
I would suspect that he would want to adjust that estimate up now with our society so much more divided and a Trump-Biden rematch is looming.
That's right. He did that 30% estimate over a year ago. And now with this Trump Biden rematch, the meanness going on in this campaign that's going to get worse, you can probably be confident there's going to be some big protests, some big demands on the police. And when the police are overwhelmed, that opens up big opportunities for looting that can get out of hand and lead to some serious trouble.
So we tend to picture this violence in downtown or shopping mall areas, but campaign events and protests often take place in neighborhoods and suburban settings. So when there are opposing groups at a campaign event, the police have to deploy a lot of troopers to keep the two sides separated.
That's very true. And you can actually see this even before a collapse sometimes. What's been going on that we've seen a lot over the past year in California, to Nordstrom's in this picture here, is well-organized gangs breaking into stores in the middle of the day and looting. And it's particularly bad in California because they have, decriminalized some things. They've made shoplifting just a misdemeanor, and it's unlikely to be prosecuted, and people know that. The other thing this opens up is opportunities for gangs to start causing trouble. And as more and more people get going, it's really harder and harder to stop them. This photo is of a Home Depot that was ransacked. Again, in the middle of the day, people come in and take huge amounts of equipment out. You want to guess what state this was in, Larry?
I'm going to take a guess it's California.
That's right. Now flash mobs can happen anywhere, looting, of course, and even this organized kind of bad looting can happen anywhere, but it's bigger and more organized in California right now.
Again, you can see the problem is that with a violent, big political campaign going on and lots of protest events, the number of police officers available to respond to the looting and marauding will be much less.
Mm-hmm.
So in this scenario, this points out a fundamental problem that we have to deal with regardless of the trigger event, which is the thing that causes a collapse. We simply do not have enough police or National Guard forces to maintain law and order if thousands or even millions of people start looting. So in this scenario, you saw several exercise messages like these two showing people taking advantage of inadequate levels of law enforcement.
And you need to remember, we've got at least 1 million gang members in the United States that we know about, probably a lot more we don't know about. And there are also 2 million Americans in jail. And we saw in our pandemic simulation last week that when there's a bad pandemic, guards aren't going to come to work and those prisoners are going to get out. If there's a grid down situation, you cannot operate a prison without electricity. Grid goes down, 2 million prisoners are going to get out. And when they get out, they've got not just no preparations, nowhere to go. So they're going to be marauders and fairly well trained ones. We've also got the problem of, we have no idea how many of the millions of illegal immigrants came into the country last year are gang members or people likely to do violence. Yes, I realize that the vast majority are very likely good people, but there are some gang members and bad people in the group as well. And particularly disturbing last year in 2023 is that there was a big jump in the number of Chinese illegal immigrants. And I've heard from a lot of national security groups and experts who think that these could actually be Chinese agents here for possible sabotage work.
And there was an amazing thing that occurred last week in New York, and that was the National Guard was called up to assist police in New York City fighting increasing violence and attacks that were occurring in the subway system. So even in good times, with no collapse, police are unable to maintain law and order. So in good, peaceful times, there are not enough police.
That's absolutely right. So in our scenario, we had a buildup in bad people and acting, and they had to call up the National Guard. Last week in New York City, they already called up the National Guard to back up police because violence there is just too much for existing police to handle. So you can be very confident that when there is a big collapse, a pandemic or some other disaster that has police overwhelmed, there is no way they're going to be able to reply to your call for help because someone's marauding and breaking into houses in your neighborhood.
So in this scenario, on election day, police and the National Guard, they're deployed to avoid violence or cheating at the polling places, and they largely succeed in that effort. But while the police were there taking care of those sites, gangs and looters took advantage of that advantage of lack of law enforcement to break into homes. So there again, it shows inadequate numbers of law enforcement officers. Now we've got some busy slides here, so you can take a look at those later, but we're going to push on through quickly.
Yeah. So in one of these scenario messages here that just came up, empowered by smartphones and social media, there's flash mobs that occurred. Again, that can happen anytime. It doesn't have to be a collapse, but that's when you get dozens of people pouring into a store to shoplift or rob. Store owner has no chance of defending themselves, and they basically pick the store clean, and then they can get out, often so fast that it's long before police can arrive. So that occurred in this scenario, but it can actually happen anytime, anywhere.
So the bottom line and an obvious conclusion is that you need to be able to protect and defend your home in a collapse, even in a relatively mild one, like this scenario that we presented this past week. So let's take a look here. So in this scenario, a political party committed to an AR-15 military-style weapons ban and groups that opposed to that decided to fight this proposal not just with the ballots, but with violence.
Yeah, and it's not just the NRA and other gun groups, but there are a lot, I would estimate tens of millions of Americans who are very adamant that they are not going to give up their AR-15s or however you want to define a military capable weapon. The AR, by the way, does not stand for assault rifle. It's a company brand name. And an assault is a rifle is a dumb name to call a class of weapons. Assault implies something that's offensive. Well, an AR-15 is not an offensive or a defensive weapon. You can use it for defense. We use them at Fortitude Ranch, and we are strictly a defensive group to defend our property. So we're not going to do assault attacks, and they're not assault weapons. They're an AR-15 and other military capable weapons. So for law abiding citizens, you do need these types of weapons to defend your home or survival facility in a collapse, because it is not going to be, one lone criminal breaking into your house, but an organized large gang of people coming to steal your supplies. They will have a lot of military capable weapons. And if you don't have them, you'll probably be dead.
Yeah, a double barrel shotgun is a nice weapon, but after 2 shots, you got to reload.
So in this scenario, there were many divisive issues, social regulations, abortion, gun control, but the gun control one was the one that caused the most violence in the scenario, the commitment of this political party to make a top priority of banning military style weapons. So in the simulations, groups opposed to the ban fought back against it. We, of course, do not endorse any kind of violence, but policymakers should understand that a ban on weapons will first of all endanger your life in a collapse or situation when there's large, ruthless marauder gangs operating. And second, policymakers should consider that a ban like this is going to be fought by a lot of Americans. So we asked a poll question in this simulation, and this is it. I'll just read it. Based not on events in this simulation, but your beliefs and preferences, what would you do if an assault rifle, quote, assault rifle ban was passed in the US with current owners required to turn over their AR-15s and other similar weapons? So for simulation players, 24% said they would comply with the law, 76% would hide their weapons, report them as stolen if authorities knew they had one, and try to keep it. And for those who answered that they would not comply, we immediately had a follow-up question that went out to them. Another screen came out, and it asked them, okay, what would you do if they knew you had it and were caught? And the vast majority of those folks said even if they were caught, they would refuse to turn in their weapons and they would fight to keep them. So you can see opposition to gun laws now that many Americans consider to be a flagrant violation of the Second Amendment. And you see it in the huge number of sanctuary states, counties, and cities where law enforcement officials or government boards have declared openly and very publicly that they will not enforce gun laws that they judge to be unconstitutional. If you add them up, most counties in the United States are refusing some gun regulations they consider unconstitutional. After we experience a collapse, my bet is that almost every locality will say no to restrictions on magazine capacities or assault weapon bans or any other impediments to having the kind of weapons you need for protecting your home and family in a collapse. And you can understand why a county sheriff would refuse to enforce an AR ban with millions of Americans willing to fight to keep them.
So in this Civil War scenario, there were some problems with the National Guardsmen not showing up for duty because they felt compelled to stay home and protect their families. And as the Civil War developed, there were some political issues again simulated in this scenario. Not something we've experienced in the past of some guardsmen not wanting to back a state governor's political agenda.
If the nation does rip apart in a civil war, I would be greatly surprised at fighting or combat like we had in our 1865 Civil War. But I do think you can see divided loyalties, and many Guard and federal servicemen and women could decline to follow orders that they believe would put them in a position of operating against fellow Americans.
So law and order, it did come back at the end of this simulation, and to a large degree because of armed citizens, militia groups that worked with the police to basically put down the marauder groups.
Yeah. People should know that there are a lot of state-sponsored official militia groups in the United States, as well as unofficial private militia groups. And some private groups may have political agendas, but my guess is that the vast majority of militia groups are strictly defensive, formed for, mutual self-defense, not offensive action, and definitely not for political purposes.
So this message mentions federal military troops at the end.
Yeah, that's right. So in the scenario, if you recall, there was a radioactive release from a nuclear power plant where they had a meltdown and explosion and a big radiation release south of Chicago. Again, this is all simulation. If you're tuning in and don't know what's going on, we're talking about simulated, not real things. So president can use federal forces for things like this. They were called in to basically do cleanup from this radioactive fallout, but it is a lot more difficult and legally risky. to get federal troops involved in local law enforcement. So the National Guard forces are really much, much better suited for this role. And in this scenario, federal troops were just used for this radiation cleanup.
So we rate the collapses in our simulations on this 5-point scale. 1 is normal peacetime, up through minor unrest situations to minor collapses. The H5N1 pandemic was a level 5 total collapse. Now, the economy was not functioning and widespread loss of law and order, violent marauding. This scenario that we played this past week was a level 2 collapse, unrest, looting, but relatively small. A very violent election could trigger an economic downturn, but the economy should keep functioning.
Yeah, if you were disappointed in the lack of a more severe collapse problem to deal with in this scenario, just stay tuned. You've got a lot of stress and challenges coming in the next simulation.
This this was not a normal scenario with bug out decisions and a loss of functioning economy. Grocery stores are bare, but there was a lot of violence, looting, and home break-ins by marauding groups that we would expect even in a big collapse. So let's run through these 6 specific risks areas for a domestic risk scenario like the Biden-Trump violent uh, election leading towards a civil war. Now, the first two are pretty simple. If you plan on doing political campaign work this year and violence and attacks on campaign workers ramps up as it did in this scenario, or you want to attend a campaign event, you should consider these risks.
Yeah, and we don't want to be accused of undermining democracy or suggesting you quit these activities. Just keep an eye out. And if you see situations starting to get out of hand, people gathering, violence could be likely, then you may want to leave.
The bigger risk is looting. We've seen this a lot in our country over the past year or so. Some protest event over issue X attracts a lot of people, and then bad people come in. Some may be gang members, others, they may take advantage of the big crowds to start looting, reasoning that with thousands of people and a few policemen, they can get away with it.
Yeah, and this could spread to home invasions and marauding, so you must be able to defend your home or your bug out location or survival community in any kind of a collapse situation.
In this scenario, Fortitude Ranch and the Survival Condo opened up for members on election day. And I know Fortitude Ranch did that 4 years
Mhm.
ago. So what's the plan this year?
Well, if it is a divisive, violent election, as so many people expect, and especially if it looks like it's going to be a close race, I think it is very likely that Fort Ranch will be open on election day. And it's not a hard thing for us to do because we're both a recreational facility as well as a survival community. So, if there is no big collapse, disaster, or violence after the election, our members can just, spend a few days vacationing. But if it is a bad collapse, then they're already there and in place.
So be thinking looters, home break-ins, even organized marauder groups when there is a big domestic unrest and police are overwhelmed.
Yeah, and once again, here you got another California example. If you tie up dozens or hundreds of policemen with crowd control in a protest or political event, then a gang or a flash mob can start looting, and there just aren't enough policemen to respond. Or the police don't know if it's a separate small looting group or the whole crowd is about to start looting. Things can get out of hand. And note the caption here: business owners were complaining in California that police weren't protecting them from looting gangs.
Looting did happen a lot in this scenario. And if these campaign events are now not downtown or in shopping areas, but in suburbs and residential areas, the looting could turn into home invasions, marauders breaking into homes. That's that's the issue in number 3 and 4 here.
Right. Which leads to a debate that many experienced preppers have discussed, and there's no clear cut answer on it. In this simulation, you were asked, what is the best weapon for home defense? I don't recommend a baseball bat as your only or main weapon, especially if it's a group of marauders breaking in, and a pistol is a lot more difficult to aim well. So for most preppers, the best choice is either a 12 gauge shotgun or an AR-15.
The shotgun does have the advantage of being less likely to travel through the house and possibly harm a family member. And the biggest advantage of the shotgun is that you're more likely to hit the bad guy.
Yeah. So the AR-15's advantages are that, first of all, you're not limited to 3 or 5 rounds. You can do a lot more. And for small people, the recoil of a 12 gauge shotgun is pretty severe. Some people find that difficult to handle.
So the last two areas of risk in this scenario deal with what happens if it's not just the election violence, but something approaching a civil war with organized groups of forces clashing.
Yeah, that did not happen in this scenario. We didn't get into the Civil War, but at the end, it was very likely that we were starting to come apart with Texas succeeding and other states like California and Colorado, counties and rural areas basically breaking off from the state.
Okay, so you're going to be emailed a short PDF report on lessons learned from this simulation tomorrow. We've discussed some of them already. So for people watching the podcast, not live after the scenario, but later, then you can get to these PDF reports.
The number one survival lesson we think you need to learn from this simulation is that anytime there's big protests or events that tie up police, there are gangs and just bad people who will take advantage of this to loot. And they're increasingly bold and violent in doing this now. So when there's a collapse disaster, even something as seemingly non-threatening as a violent political campaign, this can get out of control and it can happen very fast.
And we've seen this across the US in recent years with legitimate political protests. We're not the political protesters, but outsiders joined in. And in their agenda, it was not political at all, but purely criminal. They start
Yeah.
looting.
And a lot of them are going to be very well armed.
So you should not assume that the looting will be limited to the downtown area or retail shops or even the direct location of the big event itself that has the police tied up. Again, you must remember what happened this past week. National Guard troops were deployed to New York City subway system to help overwhelmed police deal with out of control violence.
Yeah, and the other key thing to remember is that in a collapse situations, you're probably not dealing with a lone criminal breaking into your house to steal. It's going to be a group of people, probably a lot of people, and they're going to have a lot of the weapons that some politicians would like to ban. So if you don't have not just a military capable weapon, but a high capacity magazine and a lot of guards and people defending with you, you may not survive that home invasion. So we polled twice in the simulation, asking players what they thought a civil war would look like if the nation does split after or during the selection campaign. And this slide shows you both answers at the start of the simulation we polled and then at the end. And I'm just going to cover the end simulation results. 18% of players said there will be little to no civil war violence. 26% thought there would be massive violence, largely looting, and bad people taking advantage of chaos. 37% said some states, notably Texas, will succeed, but it won't be like our 1865 Civil War. There'll be peaceful, separate successions, no military units, involved in combat. And 19% said that many states will succeed after this election, and that there'll be actual fighting between these states and the United States. The last poll question we asked at the end of the scenario was, do you think that Trump running against Biden risks causing a civil war? And most people, 59%, said yes, it does raise the risk of more election violence and a higher chance of the country splitting up. 22% said Trump running has no impact and there will be no civil war. 19% said Trump doesn't change things, the country is splitting apart regardless. And 59% said Trump is likely to incite more violence during that campaign. Breaking out that 59%, 34% of respondents said there's a slight 10% chance of a split and civil war. 25% said we've got a 50% chance of civil war at the end of this violent campaign. So that was pretty interesting.
Yes, it was. So remember that the Collapse Survivor is not just for simulations and training. It's an app to keep track of your survival stockpiled supplies, and most important, it provides real-world warnings from Fortitude Ranch Threat Watch and the Disaster Warning System. The extra hours or days warning you get from this app and from the system itself before a government issued alert comes out, that can make the difference between life and death. So this app is free for 30 days and it's just $10 a year. lessons, learn lessons to be all about death and destruction, gloom and doom. So with each one, we try to end with a bit of prepper humor.
Yeah, very little in some cases.
Yeah, that's true. So you're a prepper when you have an emergency ration stored for your pets, which by the way I do. And you also view your pets as a potential emergency rations. That's a
You
tough one
also,
for me, Drew.
yeah, well, so for some people, especially when you're hungry, yeah, they are potential rations. You also know you're a prepper when your koi pond is instead stocked with tasty catfish.
And you're probably a prepper when you view the nearest wildlife conservation area as a potential grocery store.
This is a good one, and this is from the Facebook Survival Humor Guy. I'll let you read that.
And some more prepper humor here.
And as folks in the military know, humor really is a good idea when you're under a lot of stress, and you will be under a lot of stress in a collapse situation. So try to keep your humor up when there is a collapse.
So again, we appeal to you to send your prepper humor to us. Please help us out with that. And contact collapsesurvivor.com.